Welcome to part 1 in my All About Bees Going to the Heather video collection. Today I will cover the history of going to the heather in Scotland, tell you how the moors are managed, how to choose a heather stance, how to prepare the colonies for the heather, and how and when to move your hives. Going to the heather is great fun, especially if you team up with a bee buddy or two, and the experience will give you lots of stories to share and look back on. It can also be very lucrative, especially in a good season when you can get 20 kilograms of heather honey per hive. If you are enjoying these videos, please click the like and subscribe button below, especially if you don't want to miss out on any new video releases, and I also welcome any comments or questions. I took this photograph of the heather above Tom and Tull in 2007 in my first full year as a beekeeper. And it probably tells you something about my approach to beekeeping. Quickly affected with a bad case of bee fever, I decided that I wanted to try absolutely everything I could in beekeeping. So in my very first full season I took 8 hives to the heather, and I have continued to do that with more and more hives each year. I didn't get any heather honey that year because I didn't really know what I was doing, but through trial and error and learning from more experienced beekeepers, I now manage to get a decent crop most but not every year. So this morning I'm going to share with you what I've learned about taking bees to the heather, and hopefully it will inspire you to give it a go this season, if not next. But first of all, let's look at how these moors were formed. The Scottish heather moors look natural, don't they? But it may surprise you to know that this beautiful wilderness wasn't always so, and that the wonderful landscape is well and truly man-made. After the last glaciers retreated about 13,000 years ago, the land became covered by woods of hazel, oak, alder, willow, pine and birch. And when it became warmer, elm, lime and ash trees moved in. This was a truly wild natural Scotland, but it lasted a relatively short time. Neolithic humans began to colonize and farm the land between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, and their clearance of trees to make way for their crops was pivotal in the formation of the heather moorlands. More recently, the heather moors as we know them today are a product of capitalism's development in the 19th century, infamously known as the Highland clearances, a bitter time when wealthy landowners evicted tenants in a shift from farming to sheep raising. The ruins of the 18th century townships, often in remote glens, can still be found among the bracken and the heather. These stones are the remnants of the village of Hallaig on the island of Rasay, if I've said that correctly, left empty by the Highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries. Conservation groups are now campaigning for rewilding schemes where the moors are left unmanaged and allowed to revert to forest. This is Mar Lodge Estate in Aberdeenshire, where much of the estate is being allowed to revert to forest. This landscape wants to go back to what it once was, says Sheila Rayo, the estate ecologist. Whatever you think of this idea, it is a fact that the Scottish heather moors are under threat, and it is estimated that we have lost more than 25% of our heathland since World War II. Scotland is the European stronghold for upland heather, with about a quarter of the whole surface of the country covered in it. So there really is no excuse if you live in Scotland for not taking your bees to the heather, and I actually know of beekeepers in England who bring some hives up to Scotland. These days the moors are managed for grouse hunting, and this is where the best crops of heather honey are obtained from. Grouse require young heather shoots to feed on, and this is achievable through regular and rotational heather burning, known as moor burning. They burn different patches each year in rotation, so that there are always areas of short heather and tall heather close together. Burning takes place over the winter and in early spring where there are no birds nesting on the ground and the soil is generally wet. It looks quite frightening, doesn't it? You can see the heather burning strips in the distance here on Ben Rinnes near Dufton, where I take my bees. And in this photograph you can see the strips more clearly. There is a wealth of history in Scotland of going to the heather. Here is an old photograph I found of Scottish beekeeper stalwart Alan Rheac taking his bees to the heather as a young man. Go on, Alan. In the post-war years, Glen hives, a larger version of a WBC hive, were very popular in Scotland, and this photograph from the October 1951 issue of the Scottish Beekeeper magazine shows 8 of them at the heather. Glen hives were double-skinned, and the brood box and supers were capable of taking 15 frames, so they could accommodate a very large number of bees. Although they were very cumbersome and heavy, some brave beekeepers moved them to the heather. I found this photograph of Phil McAnespie and the Ayr beekeepers moving some hives in the 1940s. Go on, Phil. Other beekeepers kept their Glen hives on permanent heather stances. Margaret Logan of Northern College in the 1950s and 60s, author of Beekeeping Craft and Hobby, was a prominent beekeeper of her era, and this is one of her permanent apiaries near Inverness. William Wilson Smith, often referred to as Willie Smith of Innerleithen, was a pioneer bee farmer in Scotland in the pre- and post-World War II years, and he developed his hive specifically for the ease of moving to the heather with top bee space, as he said, because one can break the joint and lift off the chamber without dislodging the frames. The Smith hive is not a square box, rather it is 18 inches by 16 inches, so it has short lugs. The vast majority of my hives are Smiths and I love them. Willie depended on the ling heather crop to make a living and has been described as one of the greatest ever Scottish beekeepers. Willie Smith considered the most important factors for successful beekeeping as: firstly, one must have a deep interest in the bees themselves; secondly, a good strain of bee; thirdly, a good district for honey production; and fourthly, standard equipment of simple pattern. You couldn't argue with that, could you? Willie died in 1969 and his bees and equipment were taken over by his protege George Hood, and Hood's honey is still going strong today in Scotland, run by bee farmer Stuart Hood. Despite the abundance of heather in Scotland, the number of hives taken to it is rather low. It is estimated that there are about 3,000 owners of hives in Scotland, with perhaps 15 to 20,000 colonies. Most of the heather honey marketed comes from just a few professional bee farmers. Of the 30 Scottish members of the Bee Farming Association, a dozen of them have 7,000 colonies between them, and they purposely target the ling. It's a fickle crop though. However, in a good year, as I said, yields per hive of 20 kilograms can be obtained, but in a bad year the hives can come back lighter than when they were taken. Factors such as cold, wet weather and heather beetle are unpredictable and uncontrollable, so a good crop of heather honey annually is not a given. But if there is enough rain in June to wet the heather's feet and some warmish weather, a super or two of heather honey can be achieved. There are two types of heather that the beekeeper can target on the moors: bell and ling. Bell is a hot pink colour and ling, the commonest small shrub of the Scottish moors, is pale purple pink. It's ling more than bell which most people know simply as heather, and from which we get what we know as heather honey. Both plants are in the Ericaceae family, and as you can see, bell heather has a bell flower shape with a narrow mouth, while the ling has open flowers. Bell flowers about a month before the ling, and there is about a 3-week period when they are both in flower. Many bee farmers will take hives to the heather towards the end of June, and in a good year can spin out the bell heather normally before dealing more specifically with the ling honey. Bell heather honey is a delightful runny honey, port wine coloured with a unique pleasant flavour. It cannot however be called heather honey on the label, as this description is reserved for what is known as true heather honey, the ling, Latin name Caluna vulgaris. Ling heather honey is the Rolls Royce of honey, and Scottish heather honey is known around the world as being the best. It attracts premium prices both in the jar and as cut comb honey, and the extra work involved really is worth the effort. The price for Scottish heather honey in the year before I retired was £10,652 per metric tonne. That's £4.79 a pound. That's for bulk honey, remember, compared to Scottish blossom honey at £8,401 per metric tonne, £3.81 per pound. If sold in £1 jars direct to the customer, the price of heather honey can be as much as double the price of blossom, so you can see why it is so attractive to bee farmers. Heather honey has an amber colour and settles naturally to give a creamy, soft caramel consistency. It has a strong aroma and taste like the heady scent of the flower with a hint of delicate cinnamon. It is thixotropic, that is, it normally has a jelly-like consistency and only becomes liquefied through agitation. It later returns slowly to a jelly-like state. Because of this property, it must be pressed from the combs in a special and expensive heather press, or the cells must be agitated by needles before centrifugal extraction with a tangential extractor. Many beekeepers avoid these complications by giving the bees starter strips of thin wax foundation and selling the honey as cut comb. Heather honey also has a higher water content than normal honey, which should legally be below 20%. Heather honey should be below 23%. And while this is legal, it is more at risk of fermenting, and this can be a problem if left in the hive over winter. Here we can see the air bubbles trapped in the heather honey, showing its thixotropic nature. A bit of thought must go into choosing a heather stance, and it is definitely a no-no to just plonk hives down in any old place. I've already said that managed moors are best, and permission must be sought from the landowner and consideration given to the welfare of members of the public who may be walking nearby. Shelter from prevailing wind is important, so if you can find a gully or sheltered valley, it is beneficial. Ideally, the bees should be able to fly out, up the hill and come down the hill loaded with nectar. Make sure the stance will not flood, as there have been many occasions when the bees have been partly submerged and even washed away after torrential downpours on the moorlands. Try some of these if you are struggling for sites. The Scottish Moorland Forum, the Forestry Commission, the UK peatland programme, carbon neutral farming, the Heather Trust, and any private estates you may know of. This is one of my heather stances on Ben Rinnes near Dufton, and as you can see, I have placed the hives in front of a line of trees, and this provides important shelter from the wind. Or, if you are lucky enough to find a wall like this, it will give vital protection from the wind. Peat moors are often wet underfoot, so there is the need to prevent floors getting damp. I place 4 hives on a wooden pallet with individual entrances pointing in all directions of the compass. With this arrangement, the hives support each other, and this also helps if there are sheep on the moors which can rub themselves up against a single hive, knocking it over. If you place your hives in rows at the heather, you will find that drifting will be a problem, and the hives on the end may have full supers while the others will not. The colonies have to be prepared for the heather to get a decent harvest. To put it in a nutshell, you need a young queen and a hive overflowing with young bees. A young queen will continue laying longer in the season than an old queen, and this means that the bees will put the honey in the supers, not in the brood chamber. It can be hard work for the bees at the heather, and many of the bees will be dying daily, which is another reason we want the queen to continue laying, to provide the winter bees that will get the colony through to spring. There are a few things you can do to ensure that the hive is bursting with bees. Some beekeepers place a few combs of sealed brood in the hive from other disease-free hives 3 or 4 weeks before the move. If you have hives in pairs, you can move one away to another part of the apiary, and its flying bees will enter the remaining hive. If there's a nectar flow on, there should be no fighting. This is quite safe to do. You can also rearrange the frames in the brood box to encourage the bees to store honey in the supers. This is what I do. I keep my bees in double brood box hives, and 1 week before the move I reduce the colony to 1 box of 12 or 13 frames with a queen excluder on top. I place the eggs on the outside of the brood box and emerging brood in the centre, and I repeat this again the day before the move. This will cause the bees to store the nectar in the super, not on the outer frames of the brood box, and the emerging brood will leave space for the queen to continue laying. The day before the move, I remove any honey supers, placing some on other colonies and storing some to give back to the bees on their return. I then place 1 super of drawn comb on the hive and a ventilation screen on top, so the bees don't overheat on the journey. Now, if you have your bees in a single brood box, select a really strong colony. 1 week before the move, place honey and sealed brood in the centre of the box and eggs on the outside. This should cause the bees to move the honey up into the super. Repeat the operation the day before the move, remove honey supers and add a super of drawn comb and or foundation, and maybe a second super of thin foundation, and proceed with the move as just described previously. Bees can starve while at the heather, so it is advisable to place a shallow frame of honey in the first super as a backup. If you mark this frame with a drawing pin, you can use it every year. And you can see the rest of the setup in the brood chamber here, with combs of sealed brood in the centre, with eggs and young larvae on the outside, and a frame of stores on each outside edge. I secure the hives with straps and a ventilation screen to avoid the bees overheating, block the entrance with foam when the bees have stopped flying, and leave the roofs off. I move to the heather early the next morning. Here we can see some hives strapped up. If they're not too heavy, you can use one strap. If you need to use two straps, they both go in the same direction, not opposite directions. To avoid comb slap, which can stress the bees, the hive should be positioned in the vehicle with the frames facing fore and aft. If travelling any length of time, I will pour half a cup of water through the ventilation screen to help cool the bees down. And as I said, leave the roof off during transit. At the heather, I unload the hives, place the crown board on top of them, then the roof, making sure the foam is removed from the entrance to allow the bees to fly. I can get 10 hives in my pickup if I use the cab and the front passenger seat, and so can move 10 in the morning and another 10 hives in the evening. The traditional date for moving hives to the heather is the glorious 12th of August, the start of the grouse shooting season, but experienced beekeepers know that this can often be too late. This photo was posted on Twitter by bee farmer Murray McGregor on the 22nd of July 2019, and as you can see, the nectar flow from the ling is well and truly on at this site, on Dinnet Moor. As a general rule of thumb, hives are moved to the heather for the month of August, give or take a week or two either side of the month. Although it is in flower for a couple of months, the nectar secretion can occur at any time, but given a couple of weeks of fine sunny weather, each hive should produce at least one super of honey. It's hard work on your own, so as I said, try and team up with a beekeeping buddy who actually helps with the carrying rather than just taking photographs. That's the end of part 1 of my video collection going to the heather. We've now got our hives on the heather, and in part 2 I will explain my management system on the moors, how I bring the bees home, extract the honey and prepare the hives for the winter. If you are enjoying these videos, please like and subscribe below, and consider buying me a beer, more appropriate than coffee in the heat of Spain, on my buymeacoffee.com site, where you will find lots of bee related articles. The link is under the description below. If you have already bought me a beer, thank you very much. It helps me to maintain the channel and keep posting more videos. I would also appreciate any comments or questions that you may have, and promise that I will reply to all of them. That's all for now. Adios amigos.